Good morning, and thank you for joining. We're happy to have you here. My name is Marianne O'Connell. I am the president of FranWise, and we're going to have a discussion today for franchisors relative to getting your franchisees back up and running because of or after the storms. I mean, we've gone through Harvey, we've gone through Irma. Last night, Marie devastated Puerto Rico. We've had earthquakes in Mexico. Things change, and we have to be ready for that change when it happens. I would like to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared on our website, and I'll also hand it off to our presenters if they want to share it through their lists also. Our presenters today are Leslie Anderson. She's Director of Training from Paul Davis Restoration. Ty Brewster, who is a commercial leasing agent who specializes in getting spaces for franchisees with Kaiser. And we are waiting on Sean Falk, who is an account executive specializing in franchising for Hylant Group. So we're going to do this in a little bit of a different order. We were going to start with Sean, but I'm going to take it first with Ty. So Ty, when something like this has happened and your real estate is destroyed or in pretty bad shape, what obligations do the landlords have to the franchisees?
All right, I think the first thing to think about here is you're going to go back to the lease. It's important to note here that the landlord in this case, or in any of these cases, is the individual who is not adhering to the lease document. There is a contract that you've signed where the landlord is providing a building that is tenantable to your franchisee. The minute the landlord is no longer upholding his side of the bargain, that lease has problems. That's why we've got 60-page leases now. We want to make sure that we take care of all of those issues that can happen. For example, if you've got a building that is no longer occupiable, this landlord is no longer providing the tenant what he has committed to provide. So we have language in all commercial leases that will cover these types of eventualities.
Is that the force majeure that you supplied us last night?
That's correct. There's force majeure. There's also destruction language that we'll show you in the presentation that is attached, that'll give you an idea for the remedies that occur when a landlord's unable to uphold his part of the lease.
Great. For all of you who are on the call, we did upload those pieces as handouts, so you can obtain them either now or at the end of the webinar. And you all are on mute, but we're happy to unmute you if you kind of wave your hand or send us a question in the chat box, and then we'll let you ask the question directly of the people. So Ty, you're looking at what that franchisee can do. How do they approach their landlord on that? What's the best way for them to start this communication?
Okay, the most important thing I believe is being prepared. So you need to make sure that you're reviewing your lease. Do not start this process without having read a couple of different parts of your lease, because every lease is going to be slightly different. They're going to have different language that covers these kinds of eventualities. We need to make sure that every franchisee is reading their professional. Help them take a look at that. We're more than happy here at Kaiser to provide that level of service if somebody is confused or just wants a quick review of that. We can provide them with something written to show them exactly what their individual lease states in this case. So you want to make sure that everything's documented, that you're referring to the lease, you're going after the lease language and not doing this in an emotional way. We want to make sure that this is a business transaction. Obviously, it's an emotional time. It's something that our franchisees are really struggling with, but so is the landlord. The landlord's in a difficult position too. It's important that we are partners in this and that we understand that the landlord hasn't done this to us. We're not in an adversarial relationship. We want to be partnering with them and working through them through the leases that we've got in place. So we need to make sure that there are remedies through the landlord, but that's not the last thing that we can do. We're going to talk to restoration folks. We're going to talk to insurance people. This isn't the end of our conversations. This is just the start. And we need to make sure that we've reviewed the lease to ensure that we're following the protocols that we have agreed to in the signed leases that we all have.
Would you recommend to franchisors, I mean, the clauses you're talking about in these leases, are they standard, or is this something that, you know, franchisors can require certain language in a lease? It's part of a lease addendum that's always in their franchise agreements. Is this something that they can require so that there is an extra layer of protection in the event of a disaster?
These pieces of language are in every lease. Okay. This is more for a protection of the landlord. Now remember, we have leased this space. Our franchisees are diligently paying on a monthly basis. The landlord is not providing what the landlord is supposed to provide on a daily basis once flooding occurs, or a hurricane, or a force of an act of God changes that relationship. So these are really protections for the landlord. We need to be aware of them so that we can implement those protections, and so that we're not paying for something that's not being provided. But these are not protections for us or for the franchisor. These are protections for the landlord. So we just need to understand what they are, and we need to follow the protocols in each of our individual leases to ensure that we're getting the proper protections now that the landlord's unable to adhere to their part of the bargain.
Hey, Sean, I see you're not, we don't have your webcam, but I see that you're on there. Do you have any recommendations? I mean, how does, if I go into this lease as a tenant and these clauses are there, is there anything that as a tenant I would need to do to make sure that landlord has sufficient insurance to make good on his obligations?
I missed some of the conversation as I was trying to re-log in as a presenter instead of an attendee, so I don't know where all the conversation went, but that's something that would be handled at the beginning of the lease, and at this point it's going to be difficult if you've already signed it to really have any recourse to wiggle out of some of that stuff.
True. I'm looking at going forward. What can we do as franchisors going forward to look at building in as many protections as possible for the franchisees and therefore for the entire franchise system?
Well, one of the benefits that we offer a lot of our clients is reviewing those leases, you know, just like Ty does. So we will look at the language that's not only in the franchise disclosure document but in the lease as well, and try to put the right risk in the right pocket, let's say. So the franchisor obviously wants to transfer most of the risk to the franchisee because that's where it's taking place. But the franchisee also want to make sure that the landlord has the right coverage in place as well, like you're referring to. So that's just part of the consultation of signing the lease in the first place. The franchisor would have a really tough time to be able to dictate the language that should be used in a lease. So that probably isn't something that they even want to start dabbling in. But you need someone to kind of be the moderator for all three of those entities.
So perhaps instead, and Ty, this is throwing it back to you, rather than dictate, if as franchisors people are doing a final review of those leases before they're fully executed, they might have it on their checklist to make sure that those two clauses, and I'm going to remind anybody who came in late the clauses are uploaded as handouts on this webinar, and you can download them. But they would want to put that on their checklist and make sure it's in the lease?
Yes, clearly. And we also recommend to anybody working with us that they have a professional lease reviewer or a lawyer who is part of their team that can help their franchisees to review those leases. Obviously, they're pretty extensive. And with a good lease reviewer, force majeure and destruction language will definitely be a part of their review. And they'll make sure that they are reviewing that language, maybe making certain adjustments that are going to be in favor of the tenant. Leases are always written by landlords, so we always got to make sure that we're covering our bases and protecting our franchisees through that process. It's best to have a professional who can do that consistently time after time and make sure that this language is being reviewed and that it fits something that is going to work for us when one of these things occurs.
I've never heard the term lease reviewer. In my years on the franchisor side, we used to work with attorneys. Talk to me or talk to the group, please, about what's a lease reviewer.
Attorneys, in many cases, we're dealing with franchisees that don't have the kind of deep pockets that many business people might have. So we have individuals who are lease reviewers. Some of them are lawyers, others are not lawyers, but they will review a lease at a much more nominal fee. For example, our average is probably $750 per lease to be reviewed, whereas in many cases I've seen clients pay lawyers in excess of $8,000 or $9,000 to review leases that they would end up getting essentially similar results from that review that they would from somebody who's a professional. That's all they do is review leases. Again, some of them are lawyers, some of them are not. It's something to make sure that as a franchisor you have in your arsenal to have somebody to introduce your people to that can cover their bases during the lease process. It's a very complex document that many franchisees just don't understand and feel like it's just something they're forced to sign, but we do have the ability to review that and to make some changes.
You're making me chuckle, sort of the same way they feel about franchise agreements. And we know that they don't read those in full, so for the franchisors on the line, I'd recommend that you come up with some sort of process whereby, not guaranteeing, but you're getting a level of assurance that the franchisees are in fact reading their leases and understand what's in them. I just want to remind anybody, if you came on late, this is being recorded and it will be available to you, but if you have questions on the control panel on the side of your screen, you can raise your hand. We can unmute you and let you ask a question. So Ty, one last question for you on this particular part of the subject. We're not being emotional. We've gone and looked at the lease. We've done everything you've suggested. How do you start the process and approaching the landlord? Because as you said, the landlord's also in a world of hurt. So is this a written communication? Are you trying to get in front of them face to face? What do you recommend?
You are going to base that on the language in the lease. The language within the lease is going to give you your remedy. Almost always, that remedy will include written documentation. We need to have something that starts a clock for that landlord to bring him back in compliance with the lease. Right now, if the property is untenable, the landlord's out of compliance. He needs written notice, constructive notice that can be brought to a court if it needs to be done. So in almost all cases, the leases will document how many days after the destructive event that will have to happen, and we need to make sure that we're adhering to those time frames.
Okay. Is there any time when the franchisor might get involved and try and negotiate maybe a market-wide rent relief I mean, I understand they would have to be going landlord by landlord, but is there any point where it would make sense for the franchisors that are listening to this to step to the plate and attempt that?
I think that would help their franchisees and would be a good service to provide so that they can do it in a holistic way. They might have 7 or 8 franchisees with one landlord, like a DDR or like a Kimco or Weingarten, who have a lot of Florida properties and Texas properties. So if the franchisor can get involved and do this more holistically, it can allow them to save time for the franchisee and also ensure that the landlord is a partner in this process instead of having to deal one at a time. It'll save a lot of time for those franchisees as well as for the landlord.
Great. And I'm going to circle back to you at the end of this. Sean, we don't see your smiling face, but I do have a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
And for the audience, I'd like to remind everybody that Sean is not just in the insurance realm right now. He's also a franchisee, and he's a franchisee that has locations in Texas. So this is a man with some skin in the game. Does business interruption, and I really should say the reason this call started is in talking to a client who had a lot of stores in both of the hurricane areas. Almost a third of their revenue was going to be affected by the storm. And I was surprised when they found out that business interruption insurance wasn't going to kick in if the stores were flooded. Can you address that, Sean? And with him is his coworker, Amy Schock. So if either of you want to jump in and talk about that.
Yep. So I'll start. And first off, I understand that insurance is very confusing. As a franchisee, I was often in that boat of trying to understand what the insurance agent was saying. So I'm going to try to be brief and also get the point across. So we're talking about a couple different things here with business income. First, because of the issue at hand, let's just talk about flood insurance. There's a couple different policies for flood insurance. One covers only the structure. The other one covers the contents. But that is it. There is no business income associated with flood insurance. And therefore, you will not have any business income coming in after a flood. Now, there's an excess policy that we can find. For example, if you have a particular franchisor that is emerging and 90% of their system is on the Florida coast, we can find a policy it's kind of outside of the norm that would offer some sort of business income for the franchisees in that case, and therefore flow up to the franchisor. But those are usually a little bit more expensive, and you know, the risk may or may not be there that you want to take. So going back, no business income for flood in particular. So at this point, you're kind of stuck in the middle. The franchisor, according to the franchise agreement, always has the ability, well, most of the time has the ability to expect royalties, and they can even sue for expected royalties. But to do that when your franchisee is down in the first place would probably just start the whole tornado spinning out of control. So that's not a good thing. So in this particular case with flood, we've got issues. And then there's the whole definition of what a flood is as well. So I don't want to get into too many details because your eyes will start glazing over.
Yeah, good, because I was about to ask that question. At what point is it a flood? At what point is it just a storm, like if your roof collapsed but you didn't flood out? So the franchisees are going to need to talk to their insurance agents on all of that, correct?
Yeah, and again, it more than likely in this case there's not business income available. And if I could simplify it real quick, a flood is typically defined by rising water if it then gets into your building. For example, a non-flood event would maybe be if the hurricane ripped off your roof and then water came inside. That's not a flood. That's a water event. So it's kind of different. So in some cases, there may be some franchisees who have some business income coverage, because if your roof was ripped off and water came in and now you're shut down, that is a covered peril that is tied to business income. So they may have business income ability.
What would you recommend the franchisors do, like right now, in order to help their franchisees understand their policies? We know, we've just said it before, they rarely read their franchise agreements, let alone their leases. And I know, even for myself, I don't know that I've ever really sat down and read my entire insurance policy. So how do franchisors help their franchisees unwind this mess and get moving as fast as they can?
Well, and I can tell you as a franchisee, I never read my policy either. I would give the franchise agreement requirements to my insurance agent, and I'd say, I don't understand this, I don't know what I need, put it in place and let me know how much I owe you. And I guarantee that that's what 90 to 95% of the franchisees in all systems are doing. So what can they do right now? I mean, obviously I'll promote us just a little bit, but it doesn't have to be us. It could be whatever agent you're working with. We take a very holistic approach to looking at insurance requirements from the franchisor perspective, the franchisee perspective, and everybody in between, including compliance. So if you have those requirements in your franchise agreement, you need to make sure that your franchisees actually have them in place. And I'll tell you again that a vast majority of your franchisees do not have insurance in place that is compliant with your franchise agreement. I see it absolutely every day without exception, without exception. So number one, you have to make sure that if you're going to require it, you better make sure it's there. And then number two, make sure you understand what you're actually requiring when you write it down in that franchise agreement. Sometimes franchisors will put in there some requirements that they think is good to have, but it can't even be bought on the market, and we have to amend it along the way. So make sure your franchise agreement is good to go, reviewed by an insurance person, not necessarily a lawyer. A lawyer may not understand insurance either. So make sure it's right in the first place. And then if you have franchisees that are currently in a bind and they're not sure and maybe they're not getting a response, I'm more than willing to help with that, to give you some advice or counsel on that. So reach out to me, but get your agent involved.
So not to make this a commercial, but is there a benefit? When I write manuals for companies, I find it's split, I would say 70-30, where the franchisor is just saying, here are the requirements, go use your own insurance agent and get those fulfilled. Is there a benefit, especially in a disaster case like that, like we have now, if the franchisor has required them to purchase their insurance from a single source? And what would that advantage be right now?
Yeah, so first off, requiring from a single source is very kind of unclear about the joint employer standard, so that's going to be difficult. We like to use language like preferred vendor, which means that you don't have to go with them, but there's obviously some savings typically if you go with a preferred vendor, because we can pool that risk together with particular carriers that are interested. Honestly, you guys, if you allow your franchisees, like I did as a franchisee, to just go to their local guy who's doing home and auto for him or her as well, you are going to be at risk, not only in the franchisee level, but the franchisor. The local agent who does those personal lines typically is not well versed in business, and they certainly are not well versed in franchise specific law and agreements and contracts. And so again, I'm not the only one who understands franchise insurance requirements in the industry, so that's how I'll disclaim that this is a commercial. But I mean, going with us, we have a lot of experience in it, and there are other agents out there or firms that understand franchise business, and that is where you really need to be. And you can require your franchisees. In some cases, we do have it right in the contract where they have to go and get certain lines with an agent or a carrier. So you have the ability to require, is my point. But you can typically use language that just says preferred vendor. And the State Farm guy a lot of times will write a policy, and it'll be cheap. It'll be really cheap. but it will not have the coverages in place that are going to protect them and you in the long run.
So the difference is it really is cheap, not just affordable.
That's correct.
Is there a waiting time between the storm damage and when you reach out and get in touch with the insurance agent? And how do the franchisors help coach their franchisees through that process?
Yeah, obviously getting back up and running is going to be key. So getting in touch with that agent right away. That agent should be engaged with them immediately. Now, I think one of your next questions, or part of this question, was about flood insurance. There is a 30-day wait for flood insurance no matter what. So, you know, like Puerto Rico just got hit a second time. So even if they would have said, oh my God, we got hit that first time, we need to get flood insurance in place, let's get it because I don't want this to ever happen again. Well, they still got 30 days, so they may have a second event that's going to hurt them now. So 30 days flood insurance automatic, and if you got a quote 25 days ago and a named storm is coming through today, we still cannot bind coverage while it's a named storm. So even if you pass that 30 days, the named storm also has to be out of the zone until we can bind. So flood is really picky.
They have to get in there when it's still a tropical depression and they haven't given it a name yet, right?
That's correct.
This is the weather geek in me coming out.
Right.
I want to.
Well, and to further touch on that, and this is Amy Schock with Hylant, hail and wind coverage. So the hurricane Irma, not Harvey, that was mostly flood. There still may be limited coverage for those coastal franchisees. So even though flood is automatically excluded, a lot of insurance companies, and especially in the next 6 months, I would see this happening more, are now going to exclude wind and hail coverage, or they're going to cap it in a serious way. So instead of having unlimited business income, they may limit it to $100,000, or they may put a longer waiting period where the business income coverage would come into effect. So it's not just flood that could be an issue. It could also be wind and hail coverage as well.
So the franchisors really have to stay on top of all these changes too, so that they're making the correct adjustments in their franchise agreements, right?
Right, and you could always say, you know, if you're in a designated flood zone, which I've seen this before, and also in leases, or an earthquake zone, that we're going to require this coverage. But as a franchisor, you have to understand the cost that does put on your franchisee. We know it's in their best interest to do it, but do they want to shell out the $2,500 or $5,000 additional in insurance premiums a year in order to do so?
Okay. Here's something I want to throw out to the franchisors. Again, it's probably 50-50 on this one, where you're calling out your specific insurance limits or your minimums in your franchise agreements. Others point to the manual, saying, you know, you have to do the minimums as declared in the manual. I would suggest you all go back and talk to your franchise attorneys to determine if you really are better off pointing to the manual, because the manual can be changed. Your franchise agreement is locked in for the life of the agreement, and if, as Amy is just saying, if coverages are going to change, maybe premiums are going to rise, you might have to adjust with that market. And if you're locked into what you've put into a 10-year agreement, you may be failing the franchisees and your own system at that point. So I don't know what's going to be the best way, but I would definitely say go back and talk to your franchise attorneys about that. I'd also suggest on this insurance discussion that you talk to a good and reputable insurance firm before you declare what those coverages have to be. I think Sean was being very delicate in saying, you know, attorneys don't always know insurance, and yet I do know that for the most part they are being the chief advisors as to what insurance policies you should put into franchise agreements. Don't rely on that. As you can see, this, you know, if you're a Florida-based franchise and most of your system has now either been wiped out or seriously stalled, you're going to want to make sure that you've built in the best protections for everybody. So I'm going to switch gears for a minute because I've been watching Leslie's head going up and down, because in the restoration world, they're juggling all of this. They're dealing with landlords, they're dealing with insurance, and they're dealing with what Ty opened with, the complete emotional wreck that everybody is at this time. So, Leslie, when does restoration begin?
Restoration begins immediately. As soon as you get access and it's safe to enter the property, you should be doing everything you can to mitigate that loss. Keep in mind, it is the person that owns that property's responsibility to get a plumber, get an electrician, those types of things in to immediately start mitigating the loss. Keeping in mind that the longer the damage and water stays, the more secondary damage happens in the facility or the building, whether it's just the structure itself or the contents that you have in the building. The longer the period goes, you start to get microbial growth, and then a whole other set of problems there. So very quickly, as soon as you can get safely into the facility.
Okay, so how do you coordinate, or how would a franchisee coordinate restoration services with their landlord and with their insurance company?
So you should know that up front. So when you're dealing with I'll take our building here for example. I know who to call in the event that anything happens. When we signed our lease, I wanted to know who they already had agreements with as a preferred provider for them. And not just in the event of an emergency, but who are you going to send as a plumber? Who are you going to send as an electrician? How about the HVAC? All of these are variables that we have outlined that I want to know exactly who's coming. I additionally want their contact information. So in this event, our building did sustain some damage to the HVAC and our roof, and we had a water loss here. We were able to mitigate the loss. Actually, I got out there and did it. But obviously, I want to take control. For us, I don't have time for interruption of business, nor do any of the other owners on this call. So how quickly can we get back running? And anything I can keep in my control, or numbers or contacts I have, just helps me to start to mitigate that quicker.
So when do they make the decision between going out and finding all the independent people who can help them and calling a full-on restoration service such as Paul Davis or the many others that are in the market?
Sure, absolutely. So you're going to need to have that up front with your landlord or whoever's dealing with the lease on your property. So, and I already know that up front. Who is it? Well, Paul Davis in this case, but in other instances it may be someone else. So I want to know, in the event that this happens, who are you going to be calling? Do they have a national agreement with you? Is this a company that is local to my area? Are they coming in from a different town? What is the time that it will take them to actually get on my property once it has been cleared safe for us to enter? So if they've got a national contract with a company that doesn't have a local representative, that can be several days until they're there to assist you, and that's important to know.
So let's say I'm a franchisee. I didn't do that. I didn't know up front. And I'm finding out that my landlord was probably, this is his one property. This is not the companies that Ty was talking about before that own a lot of properties. He's just got this one investment piece. He's not prepared. Can the franchisee bring in their own restoration company?
So that's something you'll have to talk with them, because now payment becomes an issue. And just like we've heard earlier on the call, in the event of a flood, a lot of times that is not a coverable loss, especially if they don't have flood insurance. And then there's some variables there as well that we heard earlier on the call. So for me, if I'm going to sign a work authorization, I want to know who's responsible for payment, who's going to be making these payments on that work authorization. So as a Paul Davis, if I go to a commercial loss and I'm helping a franchisee, I'm going to ask them who is authorized, who's the authorized agent on this property. And it wouldn't be the leasee, normally speaking, it would be the owner or the property management company.
Do you ever have Oh, go ahead, Sean.
Sorry.
Voice from heaven came in.
I know, right? I just wanted to add one thing that I think is right up Leslie's alley as well. And a lot of disasters like this, just like you have contractors that are going to fix your roof really cheap, you have restoration companies that move in very quickly and try to do it that aren't reputable. And they typically charge cash. They don't clean it very well. And then a month later, when you've got mold everywhere and you call them back, they're nowhere to be found. So when you talk about getting it done quickly and getting someone there on site, Leslie can tell you about these other firms that come in and just destroy you and take your money and really don't do what's supposed to be done.
Why don't you address that, Leslie?
It's disheartening, and we see it every time there is some type of a catastrophe. People do prey on those situations. You're so correct, and it makes me sad to tell you, but they're right. So if someone comes and they'll just arrive at your door. They either will put a door hanger on or a business card. They're generally not from the area. They're not from your hometown. They'll tell you they're from wherever they say they're from. Up front, I'm going to ask them for their insurance. I want to see everything they have. I'm probably going to check them out online if they're not from my local town, or I probably won't use them, to be honest. So you need to do your due diligence before you sign anything. And as I don't know if we spoke about it, but be careful signing anything with any of these companies. Are you signing away your rights? And that's a really important thing. They're going to want you to sign something that says that you're giving them an assignment of benefits to policies. And I'll let you guys, Sean, you're probably more experienced there than I. But I never want anyone to sign that, because then that means that when funds come in, you're giving them the ability to talk directly to your insurance company, and it can be hazardous to you getting payments as well.
Okay, Sean, do you have anything, or Amy, do you have anything to add on that?
I don't have anything else to add on that. I think she's right, and that's always a concern. It sounds like a lot of this conversation is coming down to dealing with reputable companies, people who understand your business, and are a partner with you, and not just a fly-by-night or the cheapest way to go. And I'm sure Leslie and Ty will both say that the market's competitive out there no matter what. So if you want price, we can always find you price on almost anything that you get. However, the partnership there and understanding your business and being there when there's actually a disaster and ready to clean up, and knowing that you have someone who has your best interest in mind from a franchise perspective is going to be the most important.
Okay. Ty, how often do you ever even touch on this in the leasing process? Is this something that you're ever looking at and saying, I need to understand that it's important for that tenant to understand what the landlord can and will do in the event of a disaster?
Generally, we don't deal with this because, again, we are a tenant-only broker. We focus on the franchise side. This is a problem, a greater problem for the landlord. Again, the landlord in this case is out of compliance. Our clients are in full compliance. So what we want to do is make sure that there is language for destruction, that there is language for force majeure. We want to, and normally it's not this case. Normally, and we see it a lot more often with fire, right? Fire is not limited to certain areas of the country, but these clauses cover any type of destruction of the thing that you're renting. So just the same way, if you're renting a car and that car is destroyed, you no longer have the thing that you're paying money for. This is a landlord issue, and so we want to make sure that there's language that covers what we are going to do, what our remedies are. In the case of the landlord not providing us what we have contracted for him or her to provide us. And the minute that happens, we have to follow the law, follow the lease, and make sure that we're reacting in a proper way and documenting everything so that if it does become a larger dispute, that you're covered and you can go in front of a panel, an arbitration board, a lawyer, a judge, to say, this is what we provided. The landlord did not adhere to his part of the partnership.
Okay. I knew we'd get lawyers into this at some point. So, Leslie, what are the main things that franchisees on the restoration side are going to have to look at now? You used a very broad term, microbial growth, but what are the main issues that could, if not dealt with now, could shut their business down again if it became an issue, if stuff was not remediated correctly?
Absolutely. So we'll take flooding, for instance, since we saw a lot of that in Harvey, and we did see quite a bit of it with Irma as well. So in flooding instances, we want to remove everything that those flood waters have touched, keeping in mind that flood waters are considered Category 3, meaning it's the most contaminated water that you could come into contact with. So everything that's porous that touches would need to be removed. You've probably seen photos on the news where there are the drywall has been removed. So just so you know, you want to protect yourself. So the quicker we get out all of the contents that are saturated, the drywall, the insulation, and once we get down to those studs, then the things we need to do now are disinfect and apply an antimicrobial and start to dry that structure. If that doesn't happen, and the longer that goes, this is when you start to see secondary damage. What happens here is the moisture is allowed to be there for a long period of time. And the reason I use the term microbial growth is there's all kinds of different mold spores that start to develop in a chronic water loss. Some are very damaging to you and carcinogenic, cancer-causing. One in particular, when you have a long extended water loss, mold spore called Stachybotrys, very harmful to humans, particularly our lungs. So what will happen is these aren't mitigated and they aren't done properly and dried properly. Perhaps you have a company like Sean mentioned that came in but didn't dry it properly, did some of this. Then what you will what you will see happen is mold spores will develop. You won't see them to the naked eye, but you will smell them. That's usually a first indication. And then what you're going to have to do is the whole process over again. Find out where the source of moisture is, mitigate that, dry it, disinfect it, and clean it. So mostly it can make people very sick. And keeping in mind it's not the structural materials only, but it also gets into the HVAC system. If that system is on and we've got microbial growth or any spore count within our air, now, as you know, your registers, your return, they're going to be sucked into that system, and now it's going to be disseminated, not just to the area that was affected, but to other areas of the environment as well. So the job just becomes larger in scope if it's not remediated quickly.
So I would imagine then the guiding rule would be, yes, you want to get back into business quickly, but make sure everything is done right before you do that.
Absolutely, for the people coming to your business and for your employees. Mold is nothing to play around with. Some people might just have very asymptomatic, but others may have really severe issues, and very important to take care of. And at the end of this, it's always a good idea to have someone come into your building and do a post-inspection, an indoor environmentalist or an industrial hygienist, indoor environmental professional. Do mold samples comparing what's going on out to in so that you make sure the environment inside is clean and safe.
And is that something that is usually the responsibility of the landlord, or would the franchisee want to do that to back himself up, make sure that it was done correctly?
Sure. I would say it's on the responsibility of the person conducting or owning the property. They may say they're not paying for it. In that case, I may have them come in anyway because that's for my protection. And what that will tell me, once they do, and they can do an air sample, they can do surface lift samples, they can do swab samples. And what they're doing is they're just comparing what's going on in the outside environment to the inside environment and what's the microbial growth, if there is any.
Is there anything that the franchisors can do to, I understand, and I think I didn't understand this before just now, that the onus is on the landlord to get all the things fixed up. But is there anything franchisors can do to either negotiate kind of a group effort or a group rate so that their franchisees' units can be top of the list and taken care of and open sooner?
So I'm sure there are. A lot of what we do is we have we've become a priority with a lot of, building companies we work with. So what Paul Davis will do is we will establish a partnership, like we've mentioned several times. So in the event that these things happen, most of the buildings that our franchisees are either in or they own their own, we can respond very quickly. Matter of fact, we deploy trucks all over the country to help our franchisees get back up and running in this event.
That was my question. What happens when the restoration offices are in need of restoration?
We go and help.
You said something before that I think was really important, which was have a plan in advance. And if the people on this call wanted a list of good questions that they should have their franchisees addressing up front, could Paul Davis supply that to the people on the call?
Oh, sure.
Great. So if you are interested, you guys can reach out to me, and Leslie and I can coordinate that. She has enough on her desk trying to get 2 states and a territory back up on their feet. I don't think we need to put this on her also. But it's a key piece that you, again, might want to look at, first of all, getting into your manuals under your risk management or your admin part, that these are suggested things that you need to have in place and a plan. But let's also look from the franchisor point of view. You should have some sort of disaster plan in place that protects the brand. Okay, so Irma was a little different. It devastated an entire state all at once. And I hope we never see a storm that size again. But if it's something that's going to be more isolated, you want to have a system in place that tells you which stores are closed. How bad is that damage, and what's their estimate on how long it will be until they open? How are you going to handle that with the media, and how are you going to let the customers know that, yes, store A was devastated, but store B, which is down the road, is open and will help them? So another thing you want to start to look at, that above and beyond what the outside forces are doing, you can start to control and plan inside. Now, I know, Jennifer, you asked before about crossing joint deployment lines with insurance. I hope Sean was able to answer those questions. And I don't see anybody else's hands raised. So are there any questions? And while you guys are thinking of your questions, I'm going to throw it open to our 3 presenters. What have I not asked? What's key that needs to be addressed here?
Marianne, I'll say something real quick. I think you summarized it real good there at the end, that in this case, we're chasing the tail a little bit, that there may not be a lot we can do with this event, although there's some advice out there that can be given on what is and what isn't a flood, and what the damage was and how it was caused, that I could help with. Business income, like we talked about, in a flood situation is not there, but it is in other cases. And the franchise agreement should have clauses in there that would allow you to collect some. So what we really need to do is use this as a learning opportunity, and everybody, like we did in the Marine Corps, we had contingency plans for everything, right? So you need to evaluate where your system is. If I have a franchisor that's out of Houston and he's got 25 out of his 50 stores in the Houston flood area, so he and I should be sitting down and talking about what's available and what he is willing to do. Remember that insurance in general is all about transferring risk. And maybe you don't want to transfer it all. Maybe you want to assume some of the risk. Maybe you don't want to mess with it and you want to sleep pretty every night, and you want to transfer as much risk as possible to an insurance company. So that's the decisions that we have to make based on your exposure, whether it's individually as a franchisee or collectively as a franchisor, a brand, and a system. So that it should be part of your planning. You should sit down and talk about where you're exposed and what that means to you.
Right. Ty, anything on the real estate world?
I think it's important to note your franchisees should not be paying rent on these properties that they're not able to habit. They need to make sure that the landlord is aware of that and have a plan in place that they share with the landlord as a partner for how they're going to get back into the space, get their property back in a habitable position, and begin to drive revenue again, both to them and to the landlord in every case.
Okay. Leslie, anything?
Just have a plan. I think you've heard that. It's kind of a chorus from all three of us. Know what your plan is. You know, we always think, oh, well, I'll never need that. Well, you know, we're seeing more and more that we do need one. So having a plan in place, knowing who to call, what are my next steps, certainly will alleviate some of the stress. And, you know, we haven't talked about that, but the psychological stress that a lot of our franchisees are going through right now, it's affecting their homes, it's affecting their businesses, it's affecting their families. So just be supportive of them. Just when we're all talking with them out there, I think it's real important. It's a tough time for a lot of them right now, but have a plan in place.
It brings in, Jennifer typed in a good question, and if you, Jennifer, I'm going to unmute you if you want to ask this. Whoops, there we go. Her question was, how would we handle a barrage of locations wanting to just close their doors altogether after this type of occurrence? Essentially, it would be a termination. Well, that would be more of a legal question as to whether it was abandonment, whether you were terminating them. But I think Leslie just had a good point. You've got to understand the emotional component of it and work with that, be understanding. And also, you really should be, I would imagine the stores that want to give it up altogether are the ones that are working at a marginal success rate anyway, and they don't have the reserves to get them through something like this. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that question, Jennifer? Oops, I guess I don't have her on a place where she can talk, but I hope that answered your question. Any other questions, any other comments? If not, we're coming up on just 7 minutes before our hour is up. I want to thank everyone. I mean, Leslie is quite honestly, everybody at Paul Davis, and I would imagine every restoration company in the country right now is up to their ears trying to be compassionate and yet trying to be efficient. So thank you for taking the time. Ty, quick question. Do you think this is going to make a big change in the real estate market? Are we going to see a spike in rents in those markets so that landlords are trying to recover some kind of their, some of their losses?
I don't think it's going to cause a immediate spike. I think that what you're going to see is everyone's going to be focused on getting these properties back up to speed. I think you're going to have some issues where on the margins, the marginal properties, maybe properties that are 30 years old, just aren't rebuilt, and you're going to have to deal with that. Some franchisees are going to want to reopen their stores, and the landlord's going to say it's just not worth the cost to redo this property, and you're going to have some issues there where the landlord's dictating what your franchisee is able to do. And in those cases, I think you're going to see a property rebuilt, and then you've got to go back to that landlord. They'll most likely cancel those leases, and in those cases, with the new property that replaces an older property, you are going to see some increases in costs. But I think that you're going to have some of those properties on the margins where those things happen.
And to the franchisors out there, this is not the time to hold your franchisees to the letter of the law. Work with them if they have to move their location. Work with them. Katie, Richard just asked, is it typical, Sean and Amy, for wind and hail not to be covered in a standard policy?
It depends on where you're at. So if you're in a wind and hail zone, a wind zone, there is nothing standard about it. It could be covered. It may not be covered. It may be a 2% or a 5% deductible. So that's one of those questions that is like, it depends. I get wind and hail coverage for my Houston clients all the time, so it's possible to get it. Now, just like Ty will talk to you about real estate leases, in insurance, things are negotiable as well. So when you get that first contract and you have a Houston franchisee or a Florida franchisee and it says no wind and hail, I would push back and say, you know, they need some level of a backstop of wind and hail. Even if it's got a 10 or 20,000 deductible, it's much better than not having anything at all. And I go back to those carriers and I typically get it.
This is for Leslie and for Sean, and I wish I had thought of this when we had more than 4 minutes left, but if I'm a franchisor and my franchisees have a home-based business and that home was damaged in the storm, first, Leslie, is it then just on that homeowner to bring in the restoration company and get that done?
Yeah, it absolutely is. A little different for us because we would just mitigate our own homes, but yes, it would be on them. But that would be their homeowner's policy, and what policy they have in place. I'll let Sean address that as far as coverage issues for it. But again, flooding is a fickle one, and I feel terrible for folks because it really does affect them, and a lot of coverage is just not there.
Sean, are there special insurance requirements that franchisors for home-based businesses should look at?
Yeah, I always am a little leery of the home base because I'm concerned about the franchisee thinking that they have coverage from their home policy and they don't, compared to having a commercial business policy in place. So whenever I see those, I really try to mesh through the one or the two policies they have and make sure they have it, the right coverage in place. But Leslie brings up a good point that flood insurance is fairly common among commercial or home, personal. So if they don't have flood insurance on their personal, they still won't have it, and there's still no business income anyway. The biggest difference in between personal and business flood is the amount of limits that are available on both of them.
Okay. With that, if we can take a second, and Ty, can you give us your contact information in case people have questions? And in this case, we're looking at franchisors who might want to seek your professional advice for things they're looking for in leases, how to deal with the landlords. Could you give them the best way to contact you?
Yes, if you look on that presentation, I have that on the last page, both my cell number, my office number. My office number here, 602-812-4505, or you can email me. That's on the presentation as well at tbrewster@kaiserco.com, KEYSERCO.com. I'm more than happy to spend 15-20 minutes going through any leases, giving you a written synopsis about what your remedies are, timings, and ensuring that your franchisees are covered and they're doing exactly what they need to do to get their businesses back up and running, or at least to handle the remedies within the lease for a landlord who's no longer in compliance.
Sean, your contact information in case people are looking at what do they need to look at in terms of changing insurance needs. What's your contact information?
So its phone number is 313-399-4291. 313-399-4291. My email is sean.falk@hylant.com. That's SEAN.FALK @Hylant, HYLANT as in tango.com.
Sorry, I'm laughing because I always think Marianne is a tough one to go through.
Right.
But that was good. Leslie, I'm sure you don't want them all calling you, but who could they call for some general information and assistance?
Actually, I'm going to give you my information. If you're experiencing something, you're not sure what you're looking at or maybe what needs to happen to get you back up and running as far as mitigation of your property or the place you're running, please call me. I really am here to help. It's Leslie Anderson. My number is 904-899-6193. And my email is landerson, ANDERSON, @pauldavis.com.
Thank you. If you have any questions about how to document this or how do you want to negotiate this with some of your franchisees, generally operational, my information was on your email invitation, but the number is 714-434-1516. That's 714-434-1516. 1516, and my email is Maryann, MARYANN, @franwise.net. Thank you very much to the presenters. Thank you to everyone in the audience for tuning in. We will have the recording up on the FranWise website within the next few days. And as I said, I will pass that file off to our presenters to use as they wish. Thank you all very much. I appreciate the help. Have a good day, everybody, and let's keep all the people who are affected by all these disasters in our hearts, okay? Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.